You are listening to a sermon from River Community Church in Prairieville, Louisiana.
If you have your copy of God's Word with you, please open to Genesis chapter 14. This morning, we return to Genesis 14, 1 through 16 to delve into what I'm calling the Battle of 9 Armies. Last time we were here, we considered some of the historical and archaeological connections with this narrative. And this week, we are going to focus on the military campaign itself, Abraham's pursuit and rescue of Lot, and what all this might have to teach you and me. As we begin, it's worth restating that the narrative of chapter 14 starts abruptly and introduces an entirely new scene with an entirely different tone and focus from what has come before. And this is likely because the chapter has its origins in an external account, an external record, probably an ancient Mesopotamian record of the military campaign that's described here. This is not to say, however, that these events are unrelated to the unfolding story of Abraham. In fact, these events set the stage first for Abraham's important interaction with Melchizedek, which the author of Hebrews is going to have a lot to say about, and then for God's covenant with Abraham in chapter 15. Both those stories follow necessarily and dramatically on the events recorded here in the first part of chapter 14. This chapter also continues to develop the unfortunate story of Lot. We'll discuss our text under two simple points: the Mesopotamian advance and Abraham's pursuit. But let's read it first. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. And the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim and Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim and Ham, the Emim and Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites and their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, went out and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled into the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women, and the people. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God endures forever. So let's talk about the first part of this story, the Mesopotamian advance. Chapter 14 begins by giving us the political background of the unfolding story. The geopolitical powers of Mesopotamia and the region of the Tigris and the Euphrates, near the Zagros Mountains and modern-day Iraq and Iran. These nations here in this text are Elam, Shinar, Elasar, and Goyim. They have been maintaining something of a trade protectorate over the land of Canaan for at least 12 years. It's likely that Chedorlaomer inherited this arrangement from his father. And they're currently under the banner of Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam. Canaan, though a very small and agriculturally unimportant area in itself, was vital to ancient Near Eastern trade because it provided the only safe land route between Egypt and Mesopotamia. But part of maintaining and protecting the highways throughout Canaan also meant that the cities of the region owed tribute and paid tolls and taxes and tariffs to their Mesopotamian overlords. For 12 years, this coalition of city-states in the lower Jordan River Valley around the Dead Sea had been obedient subjects of this arrangement, loyal vassals to their Mesopotamian sovereign. However, in the 13th year of Chedorlaomer's reign, the kings of these cities rebelled, which probably means they simply stopped paying their taxes. And this was a violation of their covenant duties. Thus, Chedorlaomer was sworn to exact vengeance and take what was owed him in the form of looting as the spoils of war. In other words, if the kings of the valley wouldn't pay their tribute willingly, then the tribute they owed would be taken by force. So once news of rebellion got back to Chedorlaomer in Elam about a year later, he mustered his allies from Shinar, which is Sumeria, Alarsa, which is Larsa, and Goyim, which is likely Gutium, all nation-states and city-states in power in the area of the Zagros Mountains and the deltas of the Tigris and Euphrates. He then undertook a year-long military campaign to subdue the rebellion of these five kings: Bera, king of Sodom; Birsha, king of Gomorrah; Shinab, king of Admah; Shemeber, king of Zeboim; and the king of Bela, which is Zor. 4 Mesopotamian kings versus 5 Dead Sea area kings. However, more seems to be at stake than simply quashing this little rebellion, because we see here a wide sweeping military campaign that comes down the eastern side of the Jordan River Valley through modern day Jordan, and then circles down nearly to Egypt before finally attacking the rebel kings in the valley of Siddim. And I think I might have a map here to help you follow along with what's happening. So we can just leave that up there for now. Likely what is happening here is that as these kings come from hundreds, if not thousands of miles to the east into the area of Israel and Canaan, what's happening here is that these Mesopotamian kings are consolidating power along what is known as the King's Highway. At the time, most trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia likely flowed through the west side of the Jordan River Valley, through the Canaanite hills, through Jerusalem and that area. It's also probably true that Mesopotamian power in the region was concentrated on the West Bank. But here in verses 3 through 6, Chedorlaomer is expanding his dominance and securing his hold on the region, opening up new avenues for trade between Mesopotamia and Egypt, as well as securing new tributary city-states. Now, what's most fascinating about the first part of this military campaign is that these places and people groups described in verses 5 and 6 are later recorded in the book of Deuteronomy as belonging to clans of giants. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 2. In Deuteronomy 2 and 3, we read about Israel's movement from the Sinai wilderness to the plains of Moab before they entered the land of Canaan. And in Deuteronomy 2, God is telling Moses and the Israelites and Joshua, look, you don't have claim to the lands of Ammon and Moab. They're descended. I've given them to the descendants of Lot. Right? But along the way, he says this in Deuteronomy chapter 2, beginning in verse 9. He says, Moses records, "And the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar," that's the land they live in, that hill country, "to the people of Lot for a possession." And then it says in parentheses, "The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim. The Horites also lived in Seir formerly, but the people of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave to them." We see a similar record for the land of Ammon in verses 17 through 23, which happens to also mention the Zamzummim and the Caphtorim among these giant clans. Right? And for reference, the sons of Anak, or the Anakim, are the giants which the Israelite spies encountered in the book of Numbers. And there, in Numbers 13, they are said to be descended from the Nephilim giants. So there is a close verbal connection here and conceptual connection between the Anakim, or the sons of Anak, the Rephaim, and the Nephilim. And these terms, Zuzim or Zamzummim, Emim, and Horites, and perhaps even the Caphtorim, are local terms for basically the same group of giants. More specifically, this word Rephaim is a Hebrew term that refers specifically to evil giant warrior kings in the early chapters of the Bible, such as Genesis and Deuteronomy. But later in the Bible, it comes to refer to demonic shades and evil spirits. And so there are, at the very least, there are strong connotations of necromancy and witchcraft and demonism associated with this word Rephaim, which are said to live in this eastern hill country of modern-day Jordan. Now, two such giant warrior kings that are mentioned in the Bible in this same area are Sihon and Og, kings of Heshbon and Bashan, respectively. In particular, Deuteronomy 3:11 describes the bed of Og, king of Bashan, as being made of iron in what was the early Bronze Age, or the Middle Bronze Age, and being 13 and a half feet long. Now, what's the longest king-size bed you've ever slept in? Maybe 7 feet long? 8? How tall do you have to be to need a 13 and a half foot long bed? It's also worth noting that Og, king of Bashan, ruled from the city of Ashtaroth, the same place the Rephaim live here in Genesis chapter 14. What's the point? These are seriously big, powerful, and evil people that this Mesopotamian coalition is subduing as they move south along the King's Highway. We are told this in this part of the narrative to illustrate just how formidable these Mesopotamian armed forces are as they move towards Sodom and Gomorrah. They can take out armies of giants. Now, after defeating these giant clans east of the Jordan, the Mesopotamian kings circle all the way down to Seir, south of the Red Sea, to El Paran, which is probably at the mouth of the Red Sea, and then up northwest to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh or Kadesh Barnea, and the Negev, and then finally back to Hazazon Tamar, which is in Gedi. And they're defeating the Amalekites and the Amorites living in those areas. Now, this advance involves a large sweeping motion that circles around to attack the rebel alliance of Sodom and Gomorrah from the southwest, pinching them against the eastern ridge of Jordan. The result of this whole campaign is to cut off the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the valley from any potential allies. The 5 rebels are now all on their own. As Kent Hughes notes, this well-conceived and executed strategy left the 5 kinglets at their mercy. No tribe could be summoned to help them, and they had nowhere to flee. The Transjordan was so crippled that when the coalition nations returned back to their Mesopotamian kingdoms, none would have the capacity to attack them. On top of this, they had secured the trading route between Mesopotamia and Egypt, the link between the Euphrates and the Nile. It was an awesome military achievement. Now that brings us to the Battle of Siddim itself, about which very little is said. The kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zor are named again, and then we are told that they went out and joined battle in the valley of Siddim. This means that rather than either surrendering to this impressive military force or allowing their towns to be sieged, they mustered their troops and they met their overlords on the battlefield. Now, the specific location of the battle is likely buried beneath the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea, which this text calls the Salt Sea. The region is prone to seismic activity, and the Dead Sea region in particular shows evidence that it has sunk deeper into the earth through the process of subduction over the last several millennia. Greek historian Strabo describes Sodom and the cities around it as being submerged through a violent and fiery seismic event. And as a result, the valley of Siddim is likely now about 20 feet below the surface at the southern end of the Dead Sea, which is probably why we don't have a good solid candidate for where these cities are. They may be underwater. This seismic activity is also probably responsible for the existence of the bitumen pits that are mentioned in the passage. Bitumen, by the way, is naturally occurring tar or asphalt. So the valley was filled with tar pits like those of the La Brea tar pits in California, which also happens to be right along a major fault line. In fact, they may have chosen the valley as their battlefield of choice in order to give these 5 kings a tactical home field advantage, right? We know where the tar pits are. We can position ourselves and have tactical command of the battlefield. However, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And when the Mesopotamian armies met those of the rebel alliance, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah were overrun and routed. And their armies fled and fell into these very same tar pits that they probably hoped were going to give them an advantage. Those who didn't fall into the tar pits or get killed in the field fled into the hills. And this route left the cities of the valley totally undefended. And so the Mesopotamian armies then looted and pillaged Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zor. Oh, and by the way, guess who's living in Sodom at this point? Our good old friend Lot. He's a property holder in the city, or at least he's renting. And so Lot gets himself captured along with everything he owned. Clearly, he made a good choice in where he decided to live. That brings us to Abraham's pursuit. Now, I want you to imagine Abraham at this point, just before verse 13. He's been minding his own business. He settled into a good alliance with Mamre, Aner, and Eshcol. They're Amorites, yes, but they're reliable, they're friendly, they're hospitable, and being in a covenant with them is to everyone's benefit. Over the past year or two, Abraham had probably heard about the rebellion of the kings down in the valley. He may have heard bits and pieces from across the river as the Mesopotamian armies made their advance south, but none of it was his business. Because Abraham was a sojourner in the land. He was a nobody, geopolitically speaking. He had no property. He had no rights. But that also meant he had no duties. So Canaan's political dynamics and military problems were not his to worry about. So none of this conflict between the kings of the valley and the kings of Mesopotamia would have impacted Abraham at all if it hadn't have been for Lot. And think about this. If Chedorlaomer hadn't captured Lot, he probably would have made it back home to Elam in glorious victory. But instead, Chedorlaomer returns in humiliating defeat, if he returned at all. But Chedorlaomer had captured Lot. And word of Lot's capture reached Abraham. A messenger escaped, probably some slave or shepherd of Lot's. And he came and told Abram about the raids. And then, what hadn't been Abram's problem up to this point now becomes his problem. Why? Because Abraham, unlike Cain, was his brother's keeper. Even though he and Lot had separated ways, probably not on the best terms, Abram still felt responsibility to the nephew that his father Terah had entrusted to his care. And to a man who, in some sense, believed in and called upon the name of the Lord God, Yahweh. So there Abram was, minding his own business, tending in his own flocks, when a haggard-looking servant from Sodom comes rushing up into his camp through the trees. He's told that Sodom has been sacked, and Lot has been captured by the kings from the east. Lot? Abram asks. He was living in Sodom? And now he's captured? Then what does Abram do? Does he hem and haw? Does he complain? Does he resign Lot to his well-deserved fate? Does he say, well, Lot made his bed, now he has to sleep in it? Or, well, if you live among pigs, you can expect to get dirty. No. Abraham immediately jumps to action. He musters his troops along with those of his allies. Among his troops, we see Abram is able to gather and muster 318 fighting men. The term used here describes elite warriors. The fact that they were born in his house means they have no competing loyalties. These are no mercenaries. These are warriors loyal to Abraham, and thus they have a stake in the fight. And these are his best fighters among his cowboys, among his shepherds, and his own personal bodyguards, if he had such a thing. And 318, though compared to the Mesopotamian armies, is not a lot. For a nomadic Bedouin, that's a lot. I don't have 318 fighting guys that I could call on. Do you? No, this is pretty impressive for a Bedouin. It's also likely that Mamre, Aner, and Eshcol joined forces with Abraham for this raid and pursuit. They were, after all, his sworn allies, sworn to one another's mutually defense, to come to one another's aid, militarily speaking. We also see at the end of the chapter in verse 24 that Abraham upholds their right to the spoils of war, which would seem to suggest that they participated in the raids. Now, before we look at the pursuit any further, I want you to consider the character of Abraham here, because he demonstrates three remarkable traits of character that are worth noting. First of all is courage. However much Abram has heard or hasn't heard about the might and conquest of these four Mesopotamian kings, at the very least he has heard that they trounced and overwhelmed and totally routed and plundered the armies and cities of the wealthy Jordan River Valley. He knew that he was going up against a superior armed force with proper military experience and proper military equipment. And he was taking a personal army that was dwarfed by comparison. The second character trait is loyalty, or as the Old Testament calls it, hesed. For the biblical authors, hesed is one of the primary virtues of a man of God. It is steadfast love and covenant faithfulness, first exhibited by God to his people. And then it's demonstrated by God's people to one another. It is a loving stick-to-itiveness. Hesed does the right thing for those who are close to us, whatever the cost. And that's what Abram does here. He sticks to Lot. He cannot let his nephew be captured and taken into Mesopotamia as a slave and trophy of war. He must do everything in his power to bring him back, even if it costs him his life. As John Currid notes, we must also remember the context. Lot and Abram had just separated because of quarreling. By choosing the greener pastures, Lot has effectively slapped Abram in the face. He had been mistreated by Lot, and he was about to put his life on the line for Lot. Yet that did not matter. He did his duty. The third is faith. Faith to believe the promises of God and act accordingly. Faith to say, God has given me this land and this place, and it's time for me to act like it. To paraphrase Meredith Kline, in this military action, Abraham opposed a foreign sovereign who had invaded the land which the Lord had promised to Abraham. The invader also showed himself hostile to people under his care as the Lord's covenant vassal. Abraham's vigorous response aligned with the customary requirement that the vassal take prompt military action to guard the interests of the sovereign if they were threatened. Consequently, in the aftermath of the battle, Abraham stoutly acknowledged himself as the oath-bound vassal of Yahweh. In other words, God had promised this land to Abraham. Abraham was under God's protection. And Lot was under Abraham's protection. And so, for one brief moment, we see Abraham in all his glory, as it were, acting as the king of the land that is his by right and that will be inherited by his offspring. He musters his forces and pursues a superior military force because it is his covenant duty to protect his family and to protect his land from outside military forces. 110 miles. That's how far Abraham and his warriors rode until they caught up with the Mesopotamian coalition outside of Dan on the far northern boundary of the land of promise. 110 miles riding day and night on the backs of camels and donkeys. Then, much like Gideon several centuries later, Abraham split up his forces by night, surrounded the camp of Chedorlaomer and the other Mesopotamian kings, and he descended upon them in a fury. He threw them into chaos, and he routed them. The armies fled, and Abram pursued them well outside the limits of the promised land proper. He chased them to Hobah, north of Damascus in Syria. That's another 40 miles that he chased this army out of the land of promise. He chased them out of his land like a woman chasing a cat out of the kitchen with a broom, saying, "Get on now, get!" And remember, this was the major military power of the time. This was a coalition of armed forces that has just defeated a bunch of giants before conquering 5 wealthy city-states. Now, sure, I would assume that at this point, by the time that they've almost left the land that they came to conquer, these kings and their armies are drunk on victory, drunk on wine, and drunk on beer. They are secure, resting on their laurels. Nevertheless, Abraham's victory over them was total and entire. It was nothing short of a miracle. And then Abraham recovers everything that these Mesopotamian kings had captured and left behind from the entire course of the military campaign, and including the stuff that they brought with them, their own weapons and gear and tents and camels and donkeys and swords and armor. He recovers all their booty and plunder, all the captives that they had taken, all the equipment they had left behind in their retreat. And Abraham rescued Lot and everything Lot owned. And then he returned home. So what? What are we to make of all this? And you can cut the slide now. On this 250th celebration of the independence of our own nation, I think it's important to remember that there are times when holy men must act with military vigor. Abraham was a sojourner and wanderer on the earth. He was waiting for the city that God is building, eternal in the heavens. While living among cities and peoples that were filled with unbelief and wickedness. And yet, when the military and political aggressiveness of a foreign world power meant danger to his family and it posed a real threat to the land that God had given him, Abraham took action. He took violent action. He did not run to the violence. He didn't go seeking it. He did not go meet the armies in the valley when they were attacking Sodom and Gomorrah. He did not stop their advance in the hill country of Seir to the east. But when the necessity of violence came his way, he did not hesitate. He took along even unbelieving allies into the fight, with whom he had entered a covenant for mutual self-defense. In other words, for these common realm things, he was not afraid of entering into contracts and agreements and alliances with pagan unbelievers. And even so, you and I, we have a real responsibility to protect the people that God has given us. We have a real responsibility to protect the land that God has given us, even though this land that we own, that we dwell on, is but a foretaste of the real home, the real land, the real property that is ours. Like Abraham, we too are sojourners and wanderers on the earth. Our citizenship is not really here, but in heaven. We must, like Abraham, be peaceful men, not becoming too entangled in this world's affairs. Because this world as it currently is, it is not our home. It is not where we belong. But there are still times we must act. And we must be prepared to act, even aggressively and violently if need be, to protect those we love and are responsible for, and to do good to our neighbors. As James Montgomery Boyce writes, this is the spirit in which the Christian must fight, whether his is a military, moral, or spiritual battle. He must be bold. He must be prepared. But above all, he must go in the strength of God, who said through David, "It is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle belongs to the Lord."
Thank you for listening to this sermon from River Community Church in Prairieville, Louisiana, where you will always find biblical preaching, meaningful worship, and the equipping of disciples. For more information on River Community Church and its ministries, please visit rivercommunity.org.